The courtroom camera captured the exact moment that would be replayed millions of times across news networks, social media, and true crime documentaries, the moment when 32-year-old television news anchor Vanessa Hartley heard the jury foreman announce, "Guilty of first-degree murder," and responded with a brief, chilling smile directly into the lens. It wasn't a nervous smile or a grimace misinterpreted by the camera. It was deliberate, controlled, and unmistakably aimed at the media that had once made her a local celebrity and was now broadcasting her downfall. The defendant will rise for sentencing. Judge Margaret Chen's voice cut through the stunned silence in the Maricopa County Superior Court in Phoenix, Arizona on September 28, 2023. Vanessa stood, her designer suit perfectly pressed, her blonde hair styled with the same meticulous attention she had brought to her nightly news broadcasts, her expression now carefully neutral, as if she were preparing to deliver a particularly difficult story about someone else's tragedy, rather than her own conviction for murdering her 58-year-old mother, Patricia Hartley. Judge Chen's words would be equally memorable, delivered with a gravity that reflected both the severity of the crime and the disturbing nature of the defendant. "Vanessa Hartley, you have been found guilty of first-degree murder with special circumstances murder for financial gain." The evidence presented during this trial revealed a crime of extraordinary calculation and cruelty. You poisoned your mother slowly over a period of weeks, documenting her suffering while pretending to care for her, all to inherit her estate and collect life insurance proceeds. When confronted with the evidence of your guilt, you showed not remorse but contempt, smiling at the camera as if your conviction were merely an inconvenient plot twist in your personal narrative. The judge paused, allowing the weight of the moment to settle over the packed courtroom where Patricia Hartley's surviving family members sat weeping, where journalists filled every available seat documenting a story about one of their own, and where Vanessa herself stood with that same eerie composure she had maintained throughout the trial, except for that single moment when her mask had slipped and revealed what lay beneath. The sentence of this court is death. You will be remanded to the custody of the Arizona Department of Corrections to await execution by lethal injection. May God have mercy on your soul, because this court has none. Judge Chen's pronouncement of the death sentence sent shockwaves through the courtroom and within hours across the nation as the story of the news anchor who murdered her mother and smiled at her own conviction became a cultural phenomenon dissected by psychologists, legal experts, and true crime enthusiasts, trying to understand how someone who had built a career reporting tragedy could so callously create her own. But to understand how a trusted television news personality came to be sentenced to death for matricide, we must return to the beginning, to the carefully constructed facade that was Vanessa Hartley's public life, and the darkness that lurked behind her television smile. Vanessa Hartley had been a familiar face to Phoenix television viewers for nearly 8 years, having joined KPXN Channel 7 News as a general assignment reporter in 2015 before working her way up to weekend anchor, and eventually securing the coveted 6 p.m. weekday co-anchor position in 2021. To her audience, she was the epitome of local news success, attractive, articulate, seemingly compassionate in her coverage of human interest stories, and skilled at delivering difficult news with appropriate gravitas. Vanessa had this quality that made viewers trust her, recalled her former news director, Michael Stevens, in an interview conducted after her arrest. She could make you feel like she genuinely cared about the stories she was covering, about the people she interviewed. Looking back now, I realize that what we mistook for empathy was actually exceptional acting ability. She knew exactly how to perform caring without actually feeling it. Behind the carefully curated public persona, however, those who knew Vanessa more intimately had long recognized troubling characteristics. Her ex-boyfriend, Marcus Chen, who had dated her for 2 years before their relationship ended in 2020, described a pattern of manipulation and narcissism that he had initially mistaken for professional ambition. Vanessa was obsessed with fame, with being recognized, with being important, Marcus told investigators after her arrest. Everything was about advancing her career. She would use people sources, colleagues, even friends, and then discard them when they were no longer useful. She had this ability to turn on charm like a switch when she needed something, but when we were alone, that warmth disappeared entirely. She was cold, calculating. She talked about other people like they were characters in her personal story, rather than actual human beings with their own value. Marcus described an incident that, in retrospect, should have been recognized as a serious warning sign. We were watching news coverage of a house fire where a family had died. I was obviously upset seeing the coverage, and Vanessa just looked at me with this confused expression and said, "Why are you crying? You didn't know them." She genuinely couldn't understand why someone would feel empathy for strangers. When I tried to explain, she just shrugged and said she was built differently, and that her ability to not get emotionally involved made her better at her job. Vanessa's relationship with her mother, Patricia Hartley, was similarly complex and transactional. Patricia was a retired elementary school teacher who had raised Vanessa as a single mother after divorcing Vanessa's father when Vanessa was 7 years old. Patricia had worked multiple jobs to put Vanessa through college and had been instrumental in supporting her daughter's early journalism career, providing both financial assistance and emotional support during the lean years when Vanessa was working at small market television stations for minimal pay. Patricia absolutely adored Vanessa, recalled Patricia's sister, Margaret Hartley Sullivan, Patricia's only sibling who would become a crucial figure in the investigation and trial. She was so proud of Vanessa's success. She watched every broadcast, recorded them, showed them to everyone she knew. She talked about Vanessa constantly. Looking back, I realized that Patricia's devotion was somewhat one-sided. Vanessa would visit when she needed something money, help with her apartment, someone to watch her dog, but she wasn't really present emotionally. She treated Patricia more like a personal assistant than a mother. The deterioration of their relationship accelerated in early 2022 when Patricia was diagnosed with stage 2 breast cancer. The diagnosis was serious, but the prognosis was good with treatment. Her oncologist estimated a greater than 85 5-year survival rate. Patricia began chemotherapy in March 2022, and Vanessa made a public show of being a devoted, caring daughter. Vanessa brought cameras to the hospital, recalled one of Patricia's oncology nurses, Lisa Martinez, who would later testify at trial. Not personal cameras, an actual news crew. She did a segment about being a caregiver for a cancer patient, about the importance of mammograms and early detection. She positioned herself as this loving daughter going through the difficult journey with her mother. Patricia seemed pleased by the attention initially, but I remember her making a comment to me after they left that the whole thing had been more about Vanessa than about her or her cancer. Patricia's cancer treatment was progressing well through the summer of 2022. Her tumors were responding to chemotherapy, and her doctors were optimistic about her prognosis. But in September 2022, something changed. Patricia began experiencing severe gastrointestinal symptoms: nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal pain that her doctors initially attributed to her chemotherapy, despite the symptoms being more severe than typically expected. Mrs. Hartley's symptoms were concerning, testified Dr. Robert Foster, Patricia's oncologist, during the trial. We adjusted her chemotherapy regimen, tried different anti-nausea medications, but the symptoms persisted and actually worsened. She began losing weight rapidly, became severely dehydrated, required multiple hospitalizations. What was particularly puzzling was that the pattern didn't match typical chemotherapy side effects. The timing was off. The severity was disproportionate, and some of her lab values showed abnormalities inconsistent with chemotherapy alone. Throughout Patricia's declining health in September and October 2022, Vanessa maintained her role as devoted daughter and caregiver, a role she documented extensively on her social media accounts. Her Instagram posts from this period painted a picture of a selfless daughter sacrificing her career and personal life to care for her ailing mother. Instagram post from September 15, 2022. Photo of Vanessa holding Patricia's hand in a hospital bed, Patricia looking gaunt and exhausted. Caption: hardest days of my life watching my mom fight. Cancer is cruel, but we're fighting together. Please keep her in your prayers. Cancer sucks, strong women. Mom is my hero. Instagram post from October 3, 2022. Photo of medications and medical supplies. Caption: being a caregiver means learning a whole new vocabulary. Chemo schedules, medication interactions, symptom management. I'd give anything to take her pain away. Mom, you're the strongest person I know. Caregiver Life Cancer Warrior. Instagram post from October 20th, 2022. Selfie of Vanessa looking exhausted. Caption: haven't slept more than 3 hours a night in weeks. Took a leave from the station to focus on Mom full time. She needs me, and nothing else matters right now. Your health is everything. Family first, no regrets. The social media documentation would later be revealed as part of Vanessa's careful construction of an alibi and a narrative establishing herself publicly as a loving, sacrificing daughter, so that when Patricia died, no one would question that Vanessa had been doing everything possible to save her mother, rather than systematically poisoning her. Patricia Hartley died on November 12, 2022, at Phoenix Memorial Hospital with Vanessa at her bedside. The official cause of death listed on the death certificate was multi-organ failure, secondary to metastatic cancer and complications from chemotherapy. Patricia's oncologist, while saddened by the loss, was not particularly surprised given how rapidly Patricia had declined in the final 2 months of her life. Vanessa's response to her mother's death was, to observers, appropriately grief-stricken. She cried at the hospital, planned an elaborate funeral, delivered a moving eulogy about her mother's strength and love, and posted a lengthy tribute on social media that garnered thousands of sympathetic comments from viewers, colleagues, and followers. Instagram post from November 13, 2022. Black and white photo of Patricia from years earlier, smiling. Caption: My mom, my best friend, my hero left this world yesterday. I held her hand as she took her last breath and told her I loved her and that it was okay to let go. Cancer took her body, but it couldn't touch her spirit. She was the strongest, most loving, most selfless person I've ever known. I'm lost without her, but I know she'd want me to keep going, keep fighting, keep telling stories. That's what I'll do. Rest in peace, Mom, until we meet again. The post received over 50,000 likes and thousands of comments expressing condolences. Vanessa's colleagues at the television station created a special tribute segment. Viewers sent flowers and cards. To all appearances, a devoted daughter had lost her mother to cancer. A tragic but not uncommon story that would have faded from public attention had it not been for the suspicions of one person who knew Patricia well and who found the circumstances of her death deeply troubling. Margaret Hartley Sullivan, Patricia's younger sister and Vanessa's aunt, had been close to Patricia throughout their lives. As a registered nurse with 30 years of experience, Margaret had been involved in Patricia's cancer treatment from the diagnosis, accompanying her to appointments, discussing treatment options, and helping coordinate her care. Margaret had expected Patricia's cancer to be serious but treatable based on the initial diagnosis and her sister's generally good health aside from the cancer. Patricia's decline didn't make sense to me, Margaret would later testify. I'm a nurse. I've seen countless cancer patients. Yes, some decline rapidly, but Patricia's pattern was wrong. Her initial response to chemotherapy was good. Her tumors were shrinking. Her cancer markers were improving. Then, suddenly, in September, she started having these severe GI symptoms that her doctors couldn't explain. She went from doing relatively well to dead in just over 2 months. Something felt off about it. Margaret's suspicions were initially vague, an instinctive sense that something was wrong rather than concrete evidence. But several specific incidents heightened her concerns and eventually led her to take action that would expose the truth about Patricia's death. The first incident occurred in late September 2022, about 2 weeks after Patricia's mysterious symptoms began. Margaret had gone to Patricia's home to help with some housekeeping, and found Vanessa in the kitchen preparing what she said was a special smoothie for Patricia to help with her nausea and appetite. I offered to help Vanessa make it, but she was very protective of her recipe, Margaret recalled. She said she'd been researching supplements and vitamins that could help with chemotherapy side effects, and that she'd found a special combination that she was giving to Patricia daily. I asked what was in it, and Vanessa gave vague answers about ginger and protein powder. When I tried to get more specific, nurses want to know these things because supplements can interact with medications. Vanessa became defensive and said I didn't trust her to take care of her own mother. The second incident happened in October, when Margaret accompanied Patricia to an oncology appointment. Patricia mentioned to Dr. Foster that her symptoms seemed to improve when Vanessa was away at work, but worsened when Vanessa was home taking care of her. Dr. Foster and Margaret both noted this as potentially significant. If symptoms improved when the primary caregiver was absent, it could suggest either that the caregiver was inadvertently doing something harmful or more sinister, deliberately causing harm. I'll never forgive myself for not acting on that information immediately, Dr. Foster testified. Patricia made the comment almost in passing, and I interpreted it as possibly psychological, that perhaps being alone was less stressful than having constant attention, or that Vanessa was being overly attentive with medications and food when she was home. I should have considered more seriously that something harmful might be happening. The third and most significant incident occurred on November 10, 2022, just 2 days before Patricia's death. Patricia had been hospitalized again for severe dehydration and organ dysfunction. Margaret stayed overnight at the hospital to give Vanessa a break, and during that night, Patricia, heavily medicated and drifting in and out of consciousness, said something that would haunt Margaret. Patricia grabbed my hand and said, very clearly despite her condition, "Maggie, I think Vanessa is making me sick," Margaret recalled, her voice breaking during her trial testimony. I asked what she meant, and Patricia said something about how she felt worse after Vanessa brought her drinks and smoothies, how she'd tried to refuse them, but Vanessa insisted. Then Patricia drifted back to sleep, and the next morning when I asked her about it, she didn't remember saying anything. I told myself it was the morphine talking, that she was confused. But something about the way she said it. There was this clarity in her eyes, this fear. Patricia died 2 days later, and Margaret was left with the terrible suspicion that her sister might have been murdered by her own daughter, but with no proof and with the overwhelming likelihood that no one would believe such an accusation without evidence. Patricia's death certificate listed natural causes. The hospital had no reason to suspect foul play, and Vanessa's public performance as grieving daughter was so convincing that questioning it seemed almost cruel. But Margaret couldn't let go of her suspicions, particularly as she observed Vanessa's behavior in the weeks after Patricia's death. Rather than appearing devastated, Vanessa seemed energized, almost euphoric. She returned to work at the television station just 2 weeks after her mother's funeral, appearing on air with perfect makeup and professional composure, telling viewers that her mother would have wanted her to continue pursuing her passion for journalism. More troubling was Vanessa's immediate actions regarding Patricia's estate. Patricia had left a will designating Vanessa as her sole heir, and the estate was substantial, a paid-off home in a desirable Phoenix neighborhood worth approximately $650,000, savings and retirement accounts totaling $380,000, and a life insurance policy with a payout of $500,000. Within a month of Patricia's death, Vanessa had begun the process of selling Patricia's house, liquidating her accounts, and claiming the life insurance proceeds. I watched Vanessa go through Patricia's house like she was shopping, Margaret testified. She threw away or donated most of Patricia's belongings without any sentimentality, kept only things of monetary value, and had the house listed for sale before we'd even held the memorial service. When I commented that she seemed to be moving very quickly, Vanessa said something that chilled me. She said, "Mom would want me to make practical decisions. The dead don't need houses or bank accounts. The living do." There was this coldness in how she said it, like Patricia was just a resource to be liquidated rather than a person to be mourned. Margaret made the difficult decision to contact the Phoenix Police Department in early December 2022, approximately 3 weeks after Patricia's death. She filed a report expressing her concerns that Patricia might have been poisoned, providing information about Patricia's sudden decline, her comment about Vanessa making her sick, and Vanessa's suspicious behavior after the death. Initially, we were skeptical, admitted Detective Sarah Morrison, the Phoenix PD detective assigned to investigate Margaret's allegations. Patricia Hartley had been diagnosed with cancer. She had been receiving chemotherapy. She died in a hospital with her death attributed to cancer-related complications. Her daughter was a prominent local news anchor with no criminal history and no apparent motive beyond inheritance, which is common and not criminal. We had a grieving aunt making serious allegations based largely on instinct and a few ambiguous incidents. But detective work requires following up on concerns even when they seem unlikely to pan out. Detective Morrison began a discreet preliminary investigation, reviewing Patricia's medical records, interviewing her doctors and nurses, and researching Vanessa's background. What she found gave credence to Margaret's concerns and justified a more comprehensive investigation. Patricia's medical records showed a pattern consistent with poisoning rather than cancer progression. Her symptoms, severe gastrointestinal distress, liver and kidney dysfunction, neurological symptoms, and rapid multi-organ failure, were more consistent with toxic exposure than with her breast cancer or its treatment. Additionally, several of Patricia's blood tests from September through November had shown abnormal results that her doctors had struggled to explain, including elevated levels of certain substances that could indicate poisoning. I consulted with a toxicologist about Patricia's medical records, Detective Morrison explained. The toxicologist immediately flagged several abnormalities suggesting possible antifreeze poisoning specifically. The presence of calcium oxalate crystals in Patricia's urine and elevated osmolar gap in her blood chemistry. These findings had been noted by Patricia's doctors but attributed to her cancer and treatment. However, they were also consistent with ethylene glycol toxicity. Ethylene glycol, the main ingredient in automotive antifreeze, is a poison that has been used in numerous murder cases because of its availability. Its initially sweet taste that can be masked in beverages, and its ability to cause symptoms that can be mistaken for illness. When ingested, ethylene glycol is metabolized by the body into toxic compounds that cause severe gastrointestinal symptoms, kidney failure, liver damage, neurological dysfunction, and eventually death if exposure continues. Ethylene glycol poisoning can present as a variety of seemingly unrelated symptoms, especially if administered in repeated small doses over time rather than a single large dose, explained Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the forensic toxicologist who consulted on the case. Someone receiving chemotherapy who is already experiencing some nausea and weakness could have chronic ethylene glycol poisoning, mistaken for treatment side effects. The victim feels progressively worse, develops organ failure, and eventually dies with the death attributed to their underlying illness and treatment complications, rather than poisoning. Based on the toxicologist's assessment and the suspicious pattern of Patricia's decline, Detective Morrison obtained authorization to exhume Patricia's body for comprehensive toxicological analysis. The exhumation, conducted on January 15, 2023, 2 months after Patricia's burial, would provide the critical evidence needed to transform suspicions into a murder investigation. The toxicology results were conclusive and shocking. Patricia Hartley's remains contained significant concentrations of ethylene glycol and its metabolic byproducts, definitively proving that she had been exposed to antifreeze repeatedly in the weeks before her death. The concentrations found in tissue samples were consistent with chronic poisoning, multiple doses administered over an extended period, rather than a single acute exposure. There was no question that Mrs. Hartley had been poisoned. Dr. Walsh testified at trial. The levels of ethylene glycol metabolites in her tissues, particularly in her liver and kidneys, were consistent with repeated exposure over a period of weeks to months. This was not accidental exposure. Someone had been systematically administering antifreeze to Patricia Hartley in quantities sufficient to cause her symptoms and eventually kill her. The toxicology findings transformed the investigation from preliminary inquiry to active homicide case. Detective Morrison assembled a team and began the systematic work of proving not just that Patricia had been poisoned, but who had poisoned her, and how. The evidence would demonstrate that Vanessa Hartley had planned and executed a methodical murder, documenting her actions with chilling detail while maintaining a public facade of devoted caregiving. The investigation into Vanessa Hartley proceeded on multiple fronts: financial analysis, digital forensics, witness interviews, and physical evidence collection. Each avenue of investigation revealed additional evidence supporting the theory that Vanessa had systematically poisoned her mother over a period of approximately 6 to 8 weeks, killing her slowly while positioning herself as a devoted caregiver and ensuring she would inherit Patricia's substantial estate. Financial investigation revealed that Vanessa had significant financial problems despite her seemingly successful television career. She was carrying over $85,000 in credit card debt, had taken out a high-interest personal loan for $30,000 just months before Patricia's symptoms began, and was behind on her luxury car payments. Her television salary, while respectable at $92,000 annually, was insufficient to support the lifestyle she projected on social media designer clothing, expensive restaurants, luxury vacations. Vanessa was living far beyond her means, testified forensic accountant Michael Rodriguez. She was spending approximately $140,000 per year while earning $92,000. She was financing this lifestyle through credit cards and loans, but by mid-2022, she had exhausted her borrowing capacity and was facing serious financial consequences, including potential repossession of her vehicle and collection actions by creditors. Further investigation revealed that Vanessa had been aware of the substantial inheritance she stood to receive from Patricia's estate. In June 2022, 3 months before Patricia's mysterious symptoms began, Vanessa had met with Patricia to discuss Patricia's will and life insurance. Patricia had updated her will at that time, and Vanessa had been present at the attorney's office and would have known the exact value of what she would inherit. Following that meeting, Vanessa conducted numerous internet searches about inheritance timelines, life insurance payout processes, and estate settlement procedures, testified digital forensics specialist Jennifer Santos. She was researching not just whether she would inherit, but exactly how long it would take and what steps would be involved. This suggests she was already contemplating Patricia's death and planning for the financial aftermath. The digital forensics examination of Vanessa's computers, phone, and online accounts proved devastating to any claim of innocence. Vanessa's internet search history from July through November 2022 documented a progression from financial desperation to researching murder methods to actual execution of her plan. Search history from July 2022. How to get out of credit card debt fast. Can credit card companies sue you? Personal bankruptcy, Arizona. How long does it take to inherit money? Search history from August 2022. Poison that looks like natural death. Symptoms of antifreeze poisoning. How much antifreeze would kill someone? Can antifreeze poisoning be detected in autopsy? Do cancer patients get autopsies? Cancer deaths that are investigated. Search history from September 2022, when Patricia's symptoms began. How to hide poison taste in drinks. Protein smoothie recipes. Best time to give medications to sick person. Do dying people remember things? Deathbed statements legal. The search history demonstrates clear premeditation and planning. Detective Morrison testified. Vanessa wasn't impulsively poisoning her mother. She researched methods, selected antifreeze as her weapon, because symptoms could be mistaken for her mother's cancer and treatment. Figured out how to administer it through drinks and smoothies, and anticipated potential investigative issues, including whether Patricia's death would be investigated and whether deathbed accusations would be legally problematic. Even more damning was evidence found on Vanessa's password-protected phone notes app, a detailed journal documenting her poisoning of Patricia with a clinical detachment that shocked investigators and would later horrify jurors. Entry dated September 3, 2022. Started adding small amounts to her morning protein shake. She complained it tasted slightly bitter, but drank it anyway when I told her the new protein powder was more concentrated. She's always so trusting. Makes this easier than I expected. Entry dated September 18, 2022. Symptoms are starting nausea, vomiting, stomach pain. She called her oncologist, who thinks it's chemo side effects, and adjusted her medications. Perfect. They're attributing everything to her cancer treatment, just like I planned. Added larger amount to her evening tea tonight. She's weak enough now that she doesn't question what I give her. Entry dated October 10, 2022. Had to take her to ER again for dehydration. They're running extensive tests, but still haven't figured it out. Her organs are starting to fail. Probably another 3 to 4 weeks at this rate. Posted heartbreaking photo of her in hospital bed on Instagram. Got 5,000 likes and hundreds of comments about what a devoted daughter I am. If they only knew. Entry dated October 28, 2022. She's so weak now she can barely stand. Kidney and liver values are critical. Oncologist seems puzzled. He keeps saying her cancer shouldn't cause this pattern of organ failure. Increased the amount today. Want to speed this up. I need this to be over so I can move on with my life and pay off these fucking credit cards. Entry dated November 8, 2022. 4 days before Patricia's death. She tried to tell Aunt Margaret something last night but was too drugged to be coherent. Margaret gave me a weird look this morning like she suspected something. Need to finish this quickly. We'll give maximum dose today and tomorrow. Once she's gone, there will be no investigation. Cancer patients die all the time. The journal entries provided a first-person confession to premeditated murder, documenting not just Vanessa's actions, but her cold, calculated mindset throughout the poisoning. She had treated her mother's murder like a project to be managed, documenting progress toward her goal while maintaining her public performance of devotion. Physical evidence supported the digital evidence. A search of Vanessa's apartment, conducted after her arrest, uncovered a partially empty container of antifreeze, hidden in a box of old belongings in her closet. The antifreeze bottle bore Vanessa's fingerprints and contained significantly less product than a newly purchased container should hold, suggesting she had used the contents for something other than automotive purposes. The antifreeze container was hidden under old clothes and shoes in the back of her bedroom closet, Detective Morrison testified. This wasn't antifreeze stored with car supplies in a garage. This was antifreeze deliberately concealed in a location where it wouldn't be casually discovered. Forensic analysis of residue on the container matched the type of ethylene glycol found in Patricia Hartley's remains. Additionally, investigators found the blender Vanessa had used to make Patricia's daily smoothies. Despite having been cleaned, forensic analysis detected traces of both fruit smoothie ingredients and ethylene glycol in residue within the blender mechanism. The presence of ethylene glycol in the blender, combined with Vanessa's documented pattern of preparing Patricia's drinks and smoothies, demonstrates the method by which the poison was administered, explained forensic scientist Dr. Robert Chen. Witness testimony from Patricia's friends, neighbors, and medical providers established Vanessa's opportunity and behavior during the relevant time period. Multiple witnesses testified that Vanessa had taken a leave of absence from her television job in October 2022, ostensibly to provide full-time care for Patricia, giving her unlimited access and opportunity to poison her mother. Vanessa was Patricia's primary caregiver during the worst of her symptoms, testified Patricia's neighbor, Ellen Walsh. She controlled what Patricia ate and drank, administered her medications, took her to appointments. Patricia was too weak to do much for herself, so she was completely dependent on Vanessa. Looking back, I realized that Patricia was essentially at Vanessa's mercy, and Vanessa took advantage of that trust to kill her. The most powerful witness testimony came from Margaret Hartley Sullivan, Patricia's sister, who recounted Patricia's deathbed statement that Vanessa is making me sick, and described her own suspicions that had led to the investigation. Margaret's testimony was emotional but credible, presenting her as someone who had followed her instincts despite the unlikelihood that anyone would believe a daughter could poison her cancer-stricken mother. Based on this overwhelming evidence, Vanessa Hartley was arrested on February 8, 2023, nearly 3 months after Patricia's death. The arrest made national headlines. Local news anchor charged with murdering mother was the lead story on networks across the country, with special irony attached to the fact that Vanessa's own station had to report on her arrest. Vanessa's reaction to her arrest was notable for its composure. Unlike many suspects who protest their innocence, become emotional, or demand lawyers, Vanessa's response was controlled and calculating. "I want to speak to an attorney," she stated calmly when Detective Morrison informed her of the charges. "I won't be answering any questions, but I will say this. I loved my mother. I cared for her during her final months, and I'm being falsely accused by a jealous aunt who never approved of me. The truth will come out at trial." Even in the moment of her arrest, Vanessa was thinking about narrative and image, attempting to frame the accusations as resulting from family dysfunction rather than evidence. This instinct for media manipulation would continue throughout her prosecution and would culminate in the infamous moment during her verdict when she smiled directly at the camera, apparently unable to resist one final performance for the audience that had once adored her. The legal proceedings against Vanessa Hartley began with her arraignment on February 10, 2023, where she entered a plea of not guilty to charges of first-degree murder and fraud, related to her collection of life insurance proceeds while knowing Patricia's death was not from natural causes. Her bail was set at $2 million, which she was unable to post, resulting in her remaining in custody at the Maricopa County Jail pending trial. The prosecution team was led by Deputy County Attorney Rachel Martinez, a veteran prosecutor with extensive experience in homicide cases, who recognized that while the evidence against Vanessa was overwhelming, the case presented unique challenges. The defendant was a public figure, articulate and media-savvy, Martinez explained in a post-trial interview. She had spent years on television building credibility and trust with the community. We knew she would attempt to use her media skills to manipulate the jury, and we needed to be prepared for that. The defense team, led by prominent criminal defense attorney Robert Harrison, faced the unenviable task of defending a client whose guilt was documented in her own handwriting and whose personality made her deeply unsympathetic. Harrison's strategy would focus on challenging the admissibility of evidence, arguing that the journal entries were creative writing rather than confessions, and suggesting that Patricia's death from cancer was natural despite the presence of ethylene glycol, which the defense would claim Patricia could have ingested accidentally or administered to herself. The defense strategy was always going to be difficult given the evidence, Harrison acknowledged after the trial. But our responsibility is to provide the most vigorous defense possible regardless of evidence or our personal feelings about the case. We challenged every piece of evidence, every witness, every conclusion. That's our duty in an adversarial system. The trial began on June 5, 2023, in Maricopa County Superior Court before Judge Margaret Chen, a respected jurist known for running efficient trials while ensuring defendants received fair proceedings. Jury selection took 3 days, with extensive questioning of potential jurors about their ability to be impartial regarding a defendant who was a public figure, and about their views on circumstantial evidence and the death penalty. The final jury consisted of 8 women and 4 men, ranging in age from 27 to 68, with diverse professional and educational backgrounds. Several jurors acknowledged watching Vanessa's news broadcasts, but stated they could base their verdict solely on trial evidence, rather than their previous impressions of her. Prosecutor Martinez's opening statement was methodical and powerful, laying out the chronology of events, the evidence of premeditation, and the overwhelming proof of Vanessa's guilt. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about greed, about a daughter who valued money more than her mother's life. Vanessa Hartley was drowning in debt despite her television career. Her mother, Patricia, had substantial assets that Vanessa stood to inherit. When Patricia was diagnosed with cancer, Vanessa saw an opportunity she could kill her mother. The symptoms would be attributed to cancer and chemotherapy, and she would inherit over $1.5 million to solve all her financial problems. Martinez walked the jury through the evidence systematically. The evidence will show that Vanessa researched poison methods online. She purchased antifreeze. She administered it to her mother over a period of 6 to 8 weeks, carefully documenting each dose in a journal on her phone. She watched her mother suffer, documented that suffering on social media to establish herself as a devoted caregiver, and waited for Patricia to die. When she did, Vanessa immediately began liquidating her mother's estate to pay off her debts. The prosecutor addressed the most damning evidence directly. You will see Vanessa's own words, written contemporaneously as she was poisoning her mother. She's always so trusting. Makes this easier than I expected. If they only knew. Need to finish this quickly. These aren't the words of a grieving daughter. These are the words of a cold-blooded killer documenting her crime. Defense attorney Harrison's opening statement attempted to plant seeds of reasonable doubt by suggesting alternative explanations and attacking the reliability of digital evidence. The prosecution wants you to believe that a successful television news anchor, a woman who spent years building credibility and trust, suddenly decided to murder her mother and document the crime on her phone. Does that make sense? Or is it more likely that what the prosecution calls a confession was actually creative writing, perhaps for a true crime story or a novel that Ms. Hartley was considering writing? Harrison challenged the interpretation of the evidence. Yes, antifreeze was found in Patricia Hartley's system, but Patricia was a homeowner with a car. She had access to antifreeze. Could she have accidentally ingested it? Could she have deliberately ingested it, perhaps confused by her medications or in despair about her cancer? The prosecution will present this as a clear case of murder, but I ask you to consider whether the evidence truly eliminates all other reasonable possibilities. The strategy of suggesting Patricia accidentally or deliberately poisoned herself was weak given the evidence, but it was one of the few defenses available given Vanessa's documented research into poison methods and her journal entries. Harrison's real hope was to create enough doubt about the reliability of the digital evidence that jurors might question whether they could trust the journal entries and internet searches to convict. The prosecution's case proceeded over 4 weeks, presenting a comprehensive and devastating evidentiary foundation. Medical experts testified about Patricia's cancer prognosis, her symptoms consistent with poisoning rather than disease progression, and the toxicology results proving chronic ethylene glycol exposure. Detective Morrison walked the jury through the investigation, explaining how Margaret's suspicions led to the exhumation, and how each piece of evidence pointed inexorably toward Vanessa's guilt. The digital forensics testimony was particularly damaging. Jennifer Santos, the digital forensics specialist, testified about recovering Vanessa's internet searches and journal entries, explaining the technical processes that proved the evidence was authentic and had been created by Vanessa on her devices. These entries were created on Ms. Hartley's personal iPhone, synchronized to her iCloud account, and time-stamped by Apple's servers. The entries cannot be fabricated or backdated. They were written by Ms. Hartley in real time as she was carrying out the poisoning. Santos read selected journal entries aloud to the jury, her voice steady but the words themselves shocking in their callousness. The jurors' faces showed visible horror as they heard Vanessa's own words describing poisoning her mother and anticipating the inheritance that would solve her financial problems. Several jurors took extensive notes during this testimony, and courtroom observers reported that this was the moment when any sympathy for Vanessa evaporated entirely. The forensic evidence regarding the antifreeze container and the blender provided physical corroboration of the journal entries. Dr. Robert Chen testified about finding ethylene glycol residue in Vanessa's blender, the same blender she had used to make Patricia's daily smoothies, and had documented using in social media posts about her caregiving. The presence of antifreeze in the blender, which had no legitimate automotive purpose in Ms. Hartley's apartment, combined with her pattern of preparing her mother's drinks, demonstrates the method of administration. Financial testimony established Vanessa's motive, showing the jury the stark contrast between her financial desperation before Patricia's death and her actions after paying off credit cards, purchasing a new luxury vehicle, and planning expensive purchases all within weeks of Patricia's death. Ms. Hartley went from being unable to make minimum payments on her debts to paying off $85,000 in credit card balances within 2 weeks of receiving her mother's life insurance payment, testified forensic accountant Rodriguez. Her financial desperation provides clear motive for wanting her mother dead. The most emotionally powerful prosecution testimony came from Margaret Hartley Sullivan, who recounted Patricia's final weeks, her mysterious symptoms, and her deathbed statement. Patricia grabbed my hand and said, "Maggie, I think Vanessa is making me sick," Margaret testified through tears. Those were almost her last coherent words to me. She knew. Somehow she knew what was happening to her, and I didn't protect her. I didn't believe her because I couldn't imagine a daughter doing that to her mother. Margaret's testimony was devastating, presenting Patricia not as a cancer statistic but as a real person, a loving mother, a devoted sister, someone who had worked her whole life to support her daughter and who had been betrayed in the cruelest possible way. Martinez allowed Margaret's testimony to stand on its own emotional power without excessive follow-up, letting the jury sit with the horror of Patricia's final realization that her own daughter was killing her. The defense's case was brief and largely unsuccessful. Harrison called medical experts who testified that some of Patricia's symptoms could be explained by cancer progression, but these witnesses were effectively cross-examined by Martinez, who got them to acknowledge that the specific pattern of Patricia's decline and the presence of ethylene glycol in her system were inconsistent with cancer alone. Harrison's attempt to suggest the journal entries were creative fiction rather than confessions fell flat when Martinez pointed out that the entries contained specific details that matched the timeline of Patricia's symptoms and that were written contemporaneously, not as a retrospective narrative. If these were creative writing, why did Ms. Hartley never publish this story? Why did she keep these entries password-protected and hidden? Why did the dates in the entries exactly match the dates when Patricia's symptoms worsened? The defense's most critical decision was whether to have Vanessa testify. Harrison strongly advised against it, knowing that Vanessa's personality and lack of genuine emotion would be disastrous on the witness stand. But Vanessa insisted, apparently believing she could charm or manipulate the jury as she had charmed television audiences. Vanessa's testimony was a catastrophe for the defense. taking the witness stand dressed in conservative clothing meant to convey respectability, Vanessa presented a narrative that was transparently false and contradicted by overwhelming evidence. She claimed to have been a devoted daughter, denied poisoning her mother, suggested the journal entries were creative exploration for a potential true crime project, and maintained that she had no financial motive because she never expected to inherit, despite evidence showing she had been present when Patricia's will was updated. "I loved my mother more than anything," Vanessa testified, her voice steady but her eyes dry, lacking the tears that might have conveyed genuine emotion. "I took care of her through her cancer. I sacrificed my career to be with her in her final weeks. The idea that I would hurt her is absurd and offensive." Martinez's cross-examination methodically destroyed Vanessa's testimony. She confronted Vanessa with her journal entries, reading them aloud, and asking Vanessa to explain how creative writing could contain accurate dates and details matching Patricia's medical records. She presented Vanessa's internet searches about poison methods and inheritance timelines, asking how these related to legitimate journalism or creative writing. Most devastatingly, Martinez confronted Vanessa with her own social media posts, the carefully curated images of devoted caregiving, juxtaposed with the journal entries written the same days revealing her true mindset. On October 15th, you posted this photo of holding your mother's hand with the caption, "Hardest days of my life watching my mom fight." That same day, you wrote in your journal, "Want to speed this up. I need this to be over so I can move on with my life and pay off these fucking credit cards." Can you explain that discrepancy? Vanessa had no good explanations. She became defensive, argumentative, and revealed flashes of the narcissistic personality that lay beneath her television anchor persona. When Martinez asked whether she felt remorse for her mother's death, Vanessa's response was telling. "Of course I feel bad that my mother died. Cancer is terrible. But I did everything I could to help her, and I resent the implication that I'm somehow responsible for a disease that kills thousands of people every year." The lack of genuine emotion, the defensive responses, and the obvious lies destroyed any possibility that the jury might sympathize with Vanessa despite the evidence. Several jurors later reported that watching Vanessa testify convinced them absolutely of her guilt, with one juror stating she was performing grief rather than feeling it. It was like watching someone who had studied what emotion looks like without actually experiencing it. Closing arguments reinforced the narratives both sides had presented throughout trial. Martinez's closing was powerful and comprehensive, walking the jury through every piece of evidence and explaining how it all pointed to one inescapable conclusion. Vanessa Hartley poisoned her mother slowly over 6 to 8 weeks, documenting the process in her journal, watching Patricia suffer while pretending to care for her, all to inherit money to pay off her debts. The evidence is overwhelming. Her own words convict her. Justice demands that you return a verdict of guilty of first-degree murder. Harrison's closing argument attempted to create doubt about the reliability of digital evidence and the possibility of alternative explanations, but his heart wasn't in it. The evidence was too strong and Vanessa's own testimony had been too damaging. The prosecution has presented circumstantial evidence and digital records that they interpret as proof of guilt. But remember that you must be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. If you have any doubt about the interpretation of this evidence, you must find Miss Hartley not guilty. The jury deliberated for 11 hours over 2 days before announcing they had reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed with media, Patricia's family members, and members of the public who had followed the case. Vanessa sat at the defense table, her expression neutral, her hands folded calmly, looking for all the world like she was preparing to deliver a news broadcast, rather than receive a verdict that would determine whether she spent the rest of her life in prison. "Will the defendant please rise?" Judge Chen instructed as the jury entered the courtroom. Vanessa stood, and it was at this moment that she noticed the television camera positioned in the corner of the courtroom. Arizona allows cameras in courtrooms, and major trials are often broadcast. For Vanessa, who had spent years in front of cameras, the instinct to perform for the lens was apparently irresistible, even at this critical moment. "Madam Foreperson, has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Chen asked. "Yes, Your Honor, we have." The foreperson, a 52-year-old accountant, stood with the verdict form in hand. "What is your verdict?" "In the case of the state of Arizona versus Vanessa Hartley, on the charge of first-degree murder, we the jury find the defendant guilty." The courtroom erupted in gasps and cries of relief from Patricia's family, shock from those who had perhaps held out hope for Vanessa despite the evidence. But Vanessa's reaction would be the image that defined the trial and would be replayed countless times in the days and weeks to come. For just a moment, approximately 2 seconds, captured clearly on the courtroom camera, Vanessa turned toward the camera and smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a grimace, but a deliberate, controlled smile directed at the lens as if she were signing off from a news broadcast. It was a moment of such stunning inappropriateness, such clear evidence of her narcissistic personality and her inability to understand the gravity of the situation, that it would dominate media coverage and become a cultural touchstone for discussions about psychopathy and narcissism. The smile lasted only a moment before Vanessa's attorney whispered something to her, and she regained her neutral expression, but the damage was done. The image was captured, broadcast, and immediately went viral. News anchor smiles at camera after murder conviction became one of the most watched news clips of the year, replayed millions of times and analyzed extensively by body language experts, psychologists, and media commentators. That smile told us everything we needed to know about who Vanessa Hartley really is, commented forensic psychologist Dr. Amanda Foster in one of many expert analyses of the moment. She was convicted of murdering her mother, and her instinct was to smile at the camera to perform for her audience one more time. It reveals the profound disconnect between how she sees herself as a media personality, a performer, someone putting on a show, and the reality that she's a convicted murderer. The narcissism required to smile at that moment is extraordinary. The verdict triggered the penalty phase of the trial, where the same jury would determine whether Vanessa should receive life imprisonment or death. Under Arizona law, first-degree murder with certain aggravating factors can result in a death sentence, and the prosecution was seeking death based on the aggravating factors of murder for pecuniary gain and the especially cruel, heinous, and depraved manner in which the murder was committed. The penalty phase began immediately after the verdict, with both sides presenting additional evidence and testimony focused specifically on the question of appropriate punishment. This phase would last another 2 weeks and would feature some of the most emotional testimony of the entire trial. The prosecution presented extensive victim impact testimony, allowing Patricia's family members and friends to speak about who Patricia had been and the devastating impact of her murder. Margaret Hartley Sullivan's testimony was particularly powerful, describing her sister as a devoted mother, a dedicated teacher, a generous friend, and a loving sister whose life had been stolen by the daughter she had sacrificed so much to raise. Patricia worked 3 jobs to put Vanessa through college, Margaret testified. She went without so Vanessa could have opportunities. She was so proud when Vanessa got her television job, so proud of Vanessa's success. And Vanessa repaid that love and sacrifice by poisoning her slowly, watching her suffer, documenting her deterioration on social media for attention and sympathy. Patricia died believing her daughter was taking care of her, never fully understanding until the very end that Vanessa was the one causing her pain. That betrayal is unforgivable. Vanessa deserves the death penalty. Former colleagues and friends of Patricia testified about the impact of her death on the community. Her former principal at the elementary school where she had taught described Patricia as one of the most dedicated, caring educators I ever had the privilege of working with, and explained how her sudden death had devastated students, parents, and fellow teachers who had loved her. The prosecution also presented expert testimony about the especially cruel nature of Vanessa's crime. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the forensic toxicologist, explained in detail how ethylene glycol poisoning causes death, the severe pain, the organ failure, the neurological symptoms, emphasizing that Vanessa had chosen a method that caused Patricia to suffer for weeks before finally dying. Ethylene glycol poisoning is an extraordinarily painful way to die, Dr. Walsh testified. The victim experiences severe abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, as the poison damages the gastrointestinal system. Then kidney and liver failure set in, causing additional pain and symptoms. Neurological symptoms including confusion, seizures, and altered mental status occur as the brain is affected. Patricia Hartley suffered all of these symptoms for approximately 2 months while her daughter watched and documented her suffering. This was not a quick or merciful death, it was slow torture. Prosecutor Martinez argued that the death penalty was appropriate, given the combination of aggravating factors, premeditation, murder for financial gain, special relationship of trust between victim and defendant, and the cruel manner of death. Vanessa Hartley planned her mother's murder for weeks. She researched methods. She purchased poison. She administered it slowly, watching her mother suffer, documenting that suffering for her own purposes. She betrayed the ultimate trust, the trust between mother and child. She did all of this for money, to pay off credit cards and maintain a lifestyle she couldn't afford. If these factors don't warrant the death penalty, what does? The defense's penalty phase strategy focused on Vanessa's age, 32 at the time of the crime, lack of prior criminal history, and theoretical capacity for rehabilitation. Harrison called psychologists who testified about Vanessa's troubled childhood, her father's abandonment, growing up in poverty, the pressure she felt to succeed attempting to provide mitigating context without excusing her actions. Vanessa Hartley had a difficult childhood that shaped her personality and her choices, testified Dr. Lisa Martinez, a clinical psychologist retained by the defense. Her father abandoned the family when she was 7. She watched her mother struggle financially throughout her childhood. She developed a distorted relationship with money and success, viewing financial stability as essential to her identity and worth. This doesn't excuse what she did, but it provides context for understanding how someone could make such a catastrophic decision. Harrison argued that life imprisonment was sufficient punishment and that death was excessive for a defendant with no prior criminal history who might, over decades, develop the capacity for genuine remorse. Yes, Vanessa Hartley committed a terrible crime. Yes, she should spend the rest of her life in prison. But death is final and irreversible. Life imprisonment allows for the possibility, however remote, that she might someday develop genuine understanding of the gravity of what she did. Death eliminates that possibility. Justice does not require her execution. The jury deliberated on sentencing for 2 days before announcing they had reached a decision. When they returned to the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Would they recommend life or death for the news anchor who had murdered her mother? "We, the jury, recommend that Vanessa Hartley be sentenced to death," the foreperson announced, reading from the sentencing verdict form. The recommendation was binding on Judge Chen under Arizona law, meaning she was required to impose the death sentence. Patricia's family members wept with relief, feeling that justice had been done for Patricia's suffering. Vanessa's expression remained neutral, though observers noted her jaw tighten slightly. As the sentence was announced, the only visible reaction to learning she would be executed. The formal sentencing hearing took place on September 28, 2023, nearly 11 months after Patricia's murder. Judge Chen's sentencing statement was lengthy and detailed, addressing the factors that made death appropriate despite Vanessa's lack of prior criminal history and relative youth. Vanessa Hartley, you have been found guilty of first-degree murder of your mother, Patricia Hartley, and the jury has recommended that you be sentenced to death. This court concurs with that recommendation and hereby sentences you to death by lethal injection. Judge Chen paused, allowing the weight of the sentence to settle before continuing. This case involved a betrayal of the most fundamental human relationship, that between mother and child. Patricia Hartley gave you life, raised you, sacrificed for you, and loved you unconditionally. You repaid that love by poisoning her slowly over a period of weeks, watching her suffer, documenting her deterioration while pretending to care for her, all because you wanted her money. The cruelty of what you did is almost incomprehensible. Judge Chen addressed the infamous moment when Vanessa had smiled at the camera during the verdict. Your smile upon hearing the guilty verdict revealed something essential about your character. A narcissism so profound that even being convicted of murdering your mother became an opportunity to perform for cameras. That smile showed the jury and this court that you lack the capacity for genuine remorse or empathy. You saw your murder trial as another television appearance rather than as accountability for taking your mother's life. The judge concluded with words that would be widely quoted in subsequent media coverage. you will be remanded to the custody of the Arizona Department of Corrections to await execution. You have the right to appeal, and I'm sure you will exercise that right. But I want you to understand that the evidence against you was overwhelming. Your guilt is not in doubt, and this sentence is justified by the severity of your crime and your complete lack of remorse. May God have mercy on your soul, because this court has none. As Vanessa was led from the courtroom in handcuffs for the final time, photographers captured her expression neutral, controlled, showing none of the emotion that would be expected from someone just sentenced to death. She was transported to the Arizona State Prison Complex, Perryville, where Arizona's female death row inmates are housed, to begin what would likely be years of appeals before any execution could be carried out. The case of Vanessa Hartley became a national story that transcended typical true crime coverage. The combination of elements a trusted news anchor, matricide, the slow poisoning documented in chilling journal entries, and especially that infamous smile at the camera during verdict, created a story that fascinated the public and generated extensive analysis about narcissism, media culture, and the darker side of ambition. The Vanessa Hartley case is remarkable for how thoroughly it documents the mind of a narcissistic killer, wrote Dr. Amanda Foster in a widely read article analyzing the case. Her journal entries and social media posts provide an almost unprecedented look into how someone with profound narcissistic traits can commit murder while maintaining a public facade of compassion. She documented everything: the poisoning, the performance of grief on social media, her calculation about inheritance timelines. It's as if she couldn't resist creating a narrative about herself even when that narrative would eventually provide evidence of her guilt. The smile during verdict became particularly significant in psychological analyses of the case. That smile wasn't nervousness or inappropriate affect, explained forensic psychologist Dr. Robert Chen. It was performance. Vanessa saw the camera and instinctively performed for it because that's what she had trained herself to do for years. The fact that she could smile in that moment, having just been convicted of murdering her mother, demonstrates a level of emotional disconnect and narcissism that is extraordinary even among criminals with antisocial traits. Media organizations struggled with how to cover one of their own. Vanessa's former colleagues at KPXN Channel 7 News were forced to report extensively on a woman they had worked alongside for years, creating an uncomfortable dynamic where people who had considered Vanessa a friend had to grapple with the reality that she had murdered her mother while maintaining a facade of normalcy at work. We all worked with Vanessa. We saw her every day. We had coffee with her, shared stories with her, considered her a colleague if not a friend, stated her former news director, Michael Stevens, in a statement released after the verdict. Learning that she was capable of this is deeply disturbing. We never saw any indication of the person revealed in that trial. She was professional, competent, seemingly compassionate in her reporting. It's a reminder that we never really know what's going on beneath the surface with people, even those we work closely with. The case also reignited debates about the death penalty, with opponents arguing that Vanessa's case involving someone who might genuinely have a severe personality disorder, affecting her capacity for empathy, illustrated why execution was inappropriate regardless of crime severity. Supporters of the death penalty pointed to the premeditation, the cruelty of the murder method, and Vanessa's lack of remorse as exactly the circumstances that justified capital punishment. Vanessa's appeals began immediately, with her new appellate attorneys arguing that the death sentence violated constitutional prohibitions against cruel and unusual punishment, that the trial court had erred in admitting certain evidence, and that Harrison had provided ineffective assistance of counsel. These appeals would work through state and federal courts over the following years, with Arizona's death penalty system ensuring that years, if not decades, would pass before any execution could occur. From death row, Vanessa granted a single interview to a national news magazine approximately 1 year after her conviction, carefully controlled and conducted through written questions submitted in advance. The interview provided little insight into genuine remorse or understanding, instead revealing that Vanessa continued to view herself as a victim of circumstance and family dysfunction. "I loved my mother," Vanessa wrote in response to a question about her feelings. "Our relationship was complicated, like many mother-daughter relationships. I made mistakes in how I handled my financial problems and my frustrations. But the narrative presented at trial was distorted and sensationalized. I'm not the monster they portrayed. I'm a person who made terrible decisions under extreme pressure and who is now paying a price far exceeding what justice requires." The carefully worded response, avoiding direct admission of guilt while also not claiming innocence, reflected advice from her attorneys and demonstrated that even from death row, Vanessa remained conscious of image management and narrative control. She expressed no direct remorse for Patricia's suffering or death, instead framing herself as someone whose mistakes and terrible decisions were being punished excessively. When asked about the smile during verdict, Vanessa claimed it was misinterpreted and not what people think it was. She wrote, "I've spent my career in front of cameras. Facial expressions can be captured and taken out of context. What people saw as a smile was actually a momentary expression of relief that the verdict phase was finally over, not pleasure at being convicted. The media narrative around that moment has been completely blown out of proportion." This explanation was widely rejected by both psychologists and those who had followed the trial closely. "Vanessa continues to manipulate and control narrative even from death row," commented Dr. Foster. "Her explanation for the smile is transparently false. We can all watch the video. It wasn't a misinterpreted expression, it was a deliberate smile at the camera, consistent with her narcissistic need to perform. Her inability to acknowledge this honestly, even years later, demonstrates that she remains the same person who murdered her mother and documented it while posting grief-stricken social media posts for sympathy." Patricia Hartley's family continued to grieve and to advocate for the death sentence to be carried out. Margaret Hartley Sullivan became involved in victim advocacy organizations, speaking about her sister's case and the importance of justice for murder victims and their families. "Patricia didn't just die, she was murdered slowly, painfully, by the daughter she loved and trusted," Margaret said in a speech at a victim rights conference. "Vanessa watched her suffer for weeks, documented that suffering, and profited from her death. The death sentence is appropriate and just. Patricia's life mattered. Her suffering mattered. and Vanessa needs to be held fully accountable for taking that life in such a cruel manner. The legal proceedings continued through 2024 and 2025, with Vanessa's appeals working through Arizona's appellate courts and likely eventually reaching federal courts. The overwhelming evidence against her and the lack of significant legal errors during her trial suggested that her appeals were unlikely to succeed. But the death penalty appeals process is lengthy by design, often taking 15 to 20 years between sentencing and execution. As of late 2025, Vanessa Hartley remains on death row at Perryville. Her appeals ongoing, her eventual fate uncertain, but her conviction for first-degree murder and her responsibility for Patricia's death established beyond any doubt. She exists in the strange limbo of condemned inmates alive but sentenced to death, with years stretching ahead marked by appeals and legal proceedings, while the memory of her crime and her infamous smile gradually fade from immediate public consciousness, even as they remain permanently part of true crime history. The case's legacy extends beyond Vanessa's personal fate to broader cultural impact. It influenced discussions about narcissism and social media performance, with Vanessa's carefully curated Instagram posts juxtaposed against her journal entries, becoming a teaching tool for understanding how social media personas can completely diverge from reality. It reinforced awareness about the potential for family members to be victims of violence by those they trust most. And it provided a stark example of how financial pressure combined with personality disorders can lead to catastrophic criminal decision-making. The Hartley case should serve as a warning about the dangers of unchecked narcissism, combined with financial desperation, wrote criminologist Dr. Sarah Williams in an analysis published 2 years after the trial. Vanessa Hartley wasn't an impulsive killer who snapped in a moment of rage. She was a calculating murderer who planned her mother's death over weeks, executed that plan methodically, and showed no genuine remorse even when confronted with overwhelming evidence. Her case demonstrates that some individuals, fortunately rare, possess such profound deficits in empathy and such excessive narcissism that they can commit unthinkable acts while maintaining an exterior facade of normality. For Patricia Hartley, the analysis and discussion came too late. She died in November 2022, poisoned slowly by the daughter she had raised and loved, her final weeks marked by suffering that she eventually realized was being deliberately inflicted by Vanessa. Her life, marked by dedication to teaching, devotion to her daughter, and generous love for her family, was stolen for $1.5 million that Vanessa used to pay off credit cards and maintain a lifestyle. The memorial established in Patricia's name at the elementary school where she taught continues to honor her legacy, providing scholarships for students pursuing education degrees and funding classroom supplies for teachers. It serves as a positive remembrance of Patricia's life and contributions, a counterpoint to the horror of her death. Patricia was defined by love, generosity, and dedication to helping children learn and grow, stated the principal at the dedication of the memorial. That's how we choose to remember her, not as a murder victim, but as an extraordinary educator and person whose impact on countless students will outlast the tragedy of her death. Her daughter took her life, but she couldn't erase Patricia's legacy of kindness and service. Vanessa Hartley's legacy is of a far different nature, as a cautionary tale about narcissism, greed, and the capacity for evil that can lurk beneath a carefully constructed public persona. Her smile at the camera during her murder conviction became an iconic image representing the profound disconnect between appearance and reality, between performed emotion and genuine feeling. As she sits on death row awaiting the outcome of her appeals, Vanessa remains the same person revealed during her trial, calculating, manipulative, and fundamentally incapable of genuine empathy or remorse. Whether she will eventually be executed, or whether her sentence will be commuted or overturned on appeal, remains uncertain. But her guilt is not in doubt, established by her own words documenting how she poisoned her mother slowly while maintaining a public performance of devoted caregiving. Judge Chen's words at sentencing captured the essence of why Vanessa's case resonated so profoundly. You betrayed the most fundamental human relationship, that between mother and child. You watched your mother suffer and die while pretending to care for her, all for money. Your smile at the camera during your conviction revealed a narcissism so profound that even your murder trial became a performance. You will die in prison, and that death will be far more merciful than the death you inflicted on your mother. Those words, harsh but grounded in the overwhelming evidence of Vanessa's guilt and her demonstrated lack of remorse, will define her legacy. The trusted news anchor who once delivered stories about other people's tragedies became the subject of one of the most disturbing true crime stories in recent memory. A woman who murdered her mother and smiled at the camera when convicted, revealing a chilling absence of the empathy and conscience that define our humanity.